you, if not all of you, get sent this Living Millbrook magazine. And it's good to think everybody who lives in the community gets sent this. The woman, you can have this one. The woman who runs this, Rona, was very gracious and over the summer agreed to give the Historical Society a page where we could highlight items from our archives. Our archives are great, we've got so much stuff down there, but not too many people actually get down there to see everything. So every month we pick an item from the archives, write a little bit about it, a little history of it, and it appears in the magazine. So it happened for the first time in the September issue. We've already got one for the October issue. November issue is going to go out soon. So if you get this magazine for you, toss it in the recycling bin, read that article from the Historical Society archives. Our speakers tonight are from Hopewell Depot, a little bit south of here. And as all of you probably saw in the mailing that you got, this is kind of a special two-part program. So there's the presentation tonight, an overview of railroads in Dutchess County and railroad that came through Millbrook 150 years ago. But we also are very fortunate to have them give us a tour of the depot itself, which is pretty similar to the one that was here in Millbrook that we have the model of up front here. There's still a few spaces left for that tour, limited in the number of people we can bring because it's a fairly small space. But if you want to go on that tour, it's Saturday at 11, and you just have to meet us there. Come see me before you go, and we'll reserve a spot for you. I'll write your name down so we can make sure we have a clear sense of exactly how many people are going.
And it's free.
And it's free. And it's free, exactly. Like all our programs.
Donations accepted.
Donations are compulsory. So let me introduce your speaker tonight, Paul Stitch. He'll introduce the other people who are with him. Mr. Stitch was a teacher for 30 years in the Wappingers district, taught social studies. After retiring, he went on to work for Scholastic Publishing for 20 years. He's written a number of books on historical topics, and for the last few years he's been on the board of Hopewell Depot. So we'll welcome him and turn it over to him. Thank you very much.
I do magic tricks too. I'm just going to give you a little note sheet here, and I realize the lights just went out, so you won't be able to see it, but it's something you could study at home for your next quiz. And I realize that some of you will be coming down to visit us at the depot on Saturday. And in case you're not sure of how to get there, because it's kind of in the back part of Hopewell now, the old railroad Hopewell, not IBM Hopewell, which is right on 82. So you kind of have to shift around some of the old back streets if you've not been there. It's right at the beginning of the rail trail, right where Daddy-O's restaurant is. Actually, you could park in Daddy-O's and walk up, but I've got directions in case anybody needs the directions. And I think Robert had some directions too.
I think there were directions on the mailing that went home to people.
Okay, well, I will leave these with you.
Those are probably
pick them
more
up
reliable.
later on, okay? That sheet will help you as we go along, because this is an overview of the internal railroads in Dutchess County. Obviously, what's left of the New York Central is still operating under Metro North and Amtrak, but those two railroads are on the periphery of Dutchess County. These were internal railroads, and there's not very much left of them. As we go along, I'll mention where there are some tracks still there, but they're not operational, of course. 1996, a group formed in Hopewell to try to save the old railroad station called the Hopewell Depot Restoration Corporation. They struggled for a good 15, almost 20 years before they were able to open the doors. That's a picture of it there, and that's what you'll be seeing on Saturday. If you can't come on Saturday, the door's open. We have a rack card here with our hours and what days we're open. Until the end of next month, we're open Saturday and Sunday, noon to 4. The rest of the year, we're only open on Saturdays. But it's very easy to come down and you walk through, and we have guides that will take you through and talk to you a little bit about the background, history, and so on. So it's a fun place. We're just finishing a pavilion, a picnic pavilion for the people that are going to use the rail trail itself. We have reconstructed the signal tower that was there, that was torn down in the 1930s, and that provides public restroom facilities. So if you were worried about that, you could still come down and use the restrooms if you wish. So they're open every day, and dawn to dusk. I have a team here, because what people did from 1996 until about 2012 or so was to have an outreach program where they went to groups like yours and spoke about what the project was and trying to enlist people's help. Both hammer and nails, come and help us, or give us a donation. We're still doing that to a certain extent, and Joe will talk about that later. With me, we have a little team of 3 here. With me is Joe Sullivan. He is our current president, and he put in about 45 distinguished years at IBM, most of it in Dutchess County, I think. And where's John? Oh, and John Desmond is also going to speak to you tonight. John was a professor at Dutchess Community College until recently, and he had really absolutely no idea of what he was going to do in retirement, so he wound up on our board. At any rate, they will be speaking to you a little bit later. Our premise is basically that the railroads changed life substantially in Dutchess County, especially the rural sections like Millbrook, which I'll point out to you in a little while how much it changed. And it brought Millbrook and all of the various small rural farming, agrarian types of communities, it brought them actually into the late 19th century, because they were a little lagging behind the cities. Industrial Revolution was already taking place in the cities, but the railroads brought the Industrial Revolution and industrial society, all right, into the interior of Dutchess County. After the Civil War, there was a tremendous pent-up demand. A couple of things that I'd like you to take with you on this trip that we're going to take. I have my valise here. Remember when they were called a valise? This is an overnight case. At any rate, you need a couple of things in your mind as you go along, because this can get very confusing. If you look at that sheet, you can see there are an awful lot of names that we'll probably throw around, and it gets confusing. But keep three things in mind, okay? And that's 3 things. One is investment. Rural areas were a little bit late to get on the investment bandwagon. By the 1850s, the urban areas, people were already getting more interested in investment. This was something kind of new in society, especially as the factories began to grow and people began to buy stocks. They began to realize that there was another thing to do with your money besides just spend it or save it, put it under the parlor stove, under a board in the floor, in a safe box, or in the mattress. you could invest in it, okay? And that's what makes this whole thing possible. That's what makes these railroads come alive. Some of these ideas are really pie in the sky, but they could get people to invest in it. And the period right after the Civil War was ripe for that kind of investment. So that's one idea to keep in mind. Second idea is that there was a band of players in this whole schematic. The entrepreneur. The entrepreneur who was a new class of people. They were around before the Civil War, but after the Civil War, they seemed to multiply. And some of them were hucksters, but most of them were visionaries. And they made the Industrial Revolution come to Dutchess County via the railroads. Some of these ideas that they had for railroads, you and I would not invest in, but they were able to get people to do that, to part with the money that they were saving and invest in small, short-haul railroads. And these entrepreneurs could bring together the factors of production. They could bring together the land, the real estate, buildings, technology that they needed. They could bring together the labor, not just the people who worked with their hands, but people who worked with their brains. They could assemble a management team. And they, of course, could get the capital by getting groups of people together like this and convincing them that this was a place to put their money. All right? It was not a crazy idea. So the entrepreneurs are very interesting, and especially in Millbrook, because one entrepreneur that John is going to talk about, George Brown, got the whole thing rolling in those interior railroads in Dutchess County. You put those two elements together and you have to have a third element, because it's the social change that takes place as a result of these railroads. Okay? So keep these ideas in mind. I'll leave the shirts out in case you forget. And keep in mind, too, that there was a tremendous amount of pent-up savings in the United States after the Civil War. The first railroad starts to come through here, gets rolling, and actually comes through here in 1869. But by 1865, we talk about the Civil War as being the first modern war, not just about the military technology or the military tactics, which we study a lot in school, all right? But the economy. The economy was put on a military footing. There were bond drives, and there were government contracts, and a lot of people got very rich on government contracts. Right? So the whole economy was on a war footing. Well, when you take part of your productive resources and you put them into military, right? You have to be taking something away from normal, everyday production. Commodities were not available. Right? People were investing, but they were also making money and putting it aside, because many of the commodities they would have bought with that money were not available because of the shortages created by military production. When that's over, there is a great deal of pent-up demand, both cash and credit, and people are beginning to say at the end of the war, now I can get the stuff that I've been sacrificing. Pardon me. And so, what happens is that the companies have to begin to convert over from military production to peacetime production. There's still shortages, but they are hustling to convert, especially in Connecticut and Rhode Island, where the factories really began in the United States. And there were problems arise. Now, they're also trying to convert from water power of the early factories to steam power. To do that, they needed a fuel, and the fuel is coal. And the source of coal was the Pocono Mountains to the west and the Alleghenies, but the coal was coming out of Pennsylvania. It was coming across Ulster County, it was coming across Orange County, because the railroads were already in place there. It was coming to the river, and it was turning down to New York City. It wasn't getting to Connecticut, because there were two barriers. The first barrier was the Hudson River itself. They had to conquer that. Then, when they got inside Dutchess County and wanted to head for Connecticut, they had to get over the Taconic Ridge. 700,000 foot hills, not mountains, well, Stormville Mountain. But they weren't really big mountains. But in 1867, they were very big mountains. Did Mom read to you the story of the little engine that could? Did Mom, when you grew up, did Mom tell you they couldn't? They couldn't get over those hills. Just take a ride on 84 and go up Stormville Mountain, and then you realize how much of an elevation climb. Between Stormville Village and Hopewell is a 700-foot rise. They couldn't make it over the hills. So they had to come up with some kind of schemes for these railroads to make it over into Connecticut. Now, John is going to talk to you a little bit about the railroads themselves.
While Paul's setting up here, I want to give you, this is a piece of anthracite coal. Paul mentioned that Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts were looking for coal, and this coal burned very clean, and it burned longer than bituminous did. And this was coming out of the Pocono Mountains. So this is the whole reason for many of the internal railroads in Dutchess County, including the one that ran through Millbrook. Now what we have here is a map. This over here is the New York and Harlem Valley Railroad. And this came into Dutchess County at Pauling in 1848. I believe it was New Year's Eve. The following year, also in December, is the New York and Hudson Railway, and it came up to Poughkeepsie by 1849. So those two were the two railroads, but they're at the edges of Dutchess County. Threaded all the way through these other towns and villages are wagon ruts, wagon trails, wagon roads. Not a very efficient way to begin to move along. So, as Paul mentioned before, what are you going to do? Well, they devised ferries that could carry the coal from Newburgh to Beacon. Once they got to Beacon, began in 1868 to lay the first tracks of what was then called the Dutchess and Columbia Railroad. And ran all the way up through here, ran through a town you might be familiar with, and then all the way up to here to make sure it made Pine Plains, and then over from Milton into Canaan, Connecticut. That's the first internal railroad. There is, off of this here, over in Beekman, there was an iron ore mine. And they devised a railroad in bits and pieces. It came to here, then it went over to there, and eventually got over to here when they built a mill. So those are the first railroads to come in internally. In 1871, we have the Poughkeepsie and Easton Railway right here. Coming from Poughkeepsie, moving through Pleasant Valley, missing Millbrook, and coming up here where it then joined or rented or however they worked out the deal of using the same tracks. 1873, we have the Rhinebeck Railroad that went all the way up to Columbia, didn't bother with those tracks, and went over there. Now, why would suddenly Rhinebeck? Because of the Rhinebeck River brought iron down to here. Well, what were they going to do? Send it all the way down to Poughkeepsie? Well, some entrepreneurs, as Paul mentioned, investments entrepreneurs, they were going to see if they could run a railway out of Rhinebeck. In 1881, we have the New York and New England. Now, the New York and New England is coming out of Danbury, and coming up to here, winding around Beekman, coming to Hopewell Junction. What that allowed to do is that coal could be brought up to here and then directly to southern Connecticut, over to Danbury and along the shoreline. In 1889, we have this railway sneaking through, double crossing with the Poughkeepsie and Easton, the Poughkeepsie and Connecticut, and eventually going off it and coming on it, going off it and coming on it. All these two railroads here seem to miss this town for some reason, which we'll get to in just a minute. In 1888, we have the Poughkeepsie, over here, the Highland-Poughkeepsie Railway Bridge. That came over to here. And then it could pick up one of these two Poughkeepsie lines and go over into Connecticut. However, in 1892, they decided to, let's go down to Hopewell Junction here. And Hopewell became really the center of 3 different railroads. What I'm going to read to you, Paul mentioned earlier, if you have money for investment and you have entrepreneurs, then you can begin to have, maybe begin to have a railroad. And what I'm going to read to you right now is this man, William McDermott, wrote a book about all these railroads in Dutchess County. He was a town of Clinton historian. He now lives in Connecticut, but he wrote this book. I think it's a rare copy. If you got $95 not doing anything, you might want to buy a copy. But, so we fortunately have one. And this is McDermott's account of how George Brown, who, by the way, was right around this area right here, in 1867, proposed this railroad to come all the way down to Beacon. So this is McDermott talking about Brown. This railroad, the Dutchess and Columbia, was of a different class than others, such as the New York and Harlem and the New York and Hudson River railroads. William McDermott's explanation of how it was to be funded provides insight into the specific politics of building a railroad. Chairman George Brown made clear that he did not want capitalists from a distance to take stock in this road and so get control of it, as it was intended the road should belong to the people and not to a few money people. Now, what he was talking about is not on a map, but it could be people in New York City who might have an interest in that. So he didn't want that for 2 reasons. One, he wanted to be the president of this railroad, not necessarily somebody from New York City. And number 2, he was trying to motivate the towns, the farmers, the lumber mills, the grain mills, all the way along here. He was trying to motivate them to contribute money for the building of this railroad. Yet, this is again McDermott commenting on Brown, yet in only a slightly veiled threat, he reminded farmers along the route that if they and their town governments failed to invest, Brown would have to accept offers from Poughkeepsie investors. Well, Poughkeepsie would be a lot safer than New York City, in the sense that Brown could probably go and league with these people. Down in New York City, you probably couldn't. Brown would have to accept offers from Poughkeepsie investors. Then the line would be built from Poughkeepsie to Millerton by way of Pleasant Valley, Salt Point, Stanfordville, and Pine Plains. So it looks like one of these or both of these combination of those Poughkeepsie railroads. But Brown didn't want a part of that. This was still 1867, no internal railroad. The Fishkill Valley and its great milk region and also ore beds and marble quarries would be deprived of a rail route to export their product and a chance to import coal directly from Pennsylvania. Construction would not begin until $500,000 in 1867 money was raised. So that gives you an idea of what was involved in the seriousness of this particular thing. By the way, if you happen to live in Millbrook and you wanted to go to the large city of Poughkeepsie, or if you wanted to go to the huge city of New York, what could you do? You had this railroad, which by then was called the Newburgh, Dutchess, and Connecticut Railway. These railroads have changed hands. We're going to have another former board member talk about the different roads and the different names for them. So you had 2 choices. You could take a train that would bring you up maybe to here, and then you could go down to Poughkeepsie. Or on the other hand, you could come all the way down to Hopewell Junction, visit us, and you would stand on a platform to take a train that would come up here to Poughkeepsie Point. So it's roundabout, so you folks here.
Or Danbury.
Or you could go to Danbury. Largest, those days, maybe a larger city than Poughkeepsie, so that would be thinking. Another thing I want to read to you a little bit about is in 1870, this is the first year of the Dutchess in Columbia, a reporter for the Fishkill Standard. Fishkill Standard, you gotta remember Fishkill, Beacon didn't exist then. This was Fishkill Landing, then it was Matawan, and then you moved into Glenham, the village of Fishkill, Brinkerhoff, and then finally you got out of Fishkill and you went into East Fishkill. So in 1870, so this is one of the first trains to go out, a reporter for the Fishkill Standard wrote on it. So this will give us a glimpse of what it would be like to ride on one of these trains. See, the train consisted of the Taunton-built locomotive, regular number 5, drawing a clove branch car, presumably a freight car, and one regular and nicely fitted up passenger car. The locomotive was gaily decorated with flags. This was like a mayor's, special mayor's train to show them the railroad. Thus the reporter. At 10:45 a.m., Conductor Bailey gave the starting signal. There was a rush of tardy voyages, and then down the Hudson River Road to the junction, Dutchess Junction. It exists today only as a sign, but it did come down to here, Dutchess Junction. Rattled the train. One or two switches were crossed, a little backing, a little filling, and then we started head-on over the trestle work, through the rock cuts, and by Matawan we went without stopping. And then came to Fishkill. There, a number got out of the cars, shook hands with friends, smiled patronizingly at the pretty telegraph operator, jumped aboard again, and in a moment the train was once more off. Let's note that for a second. Women often were employed as telegraph operators in these stations. Sometimes you might have 3 people in a station, a telegraph operator, a ticket agent, and then who would also double as a passenger agent, and you had a freight agent. And some of these jobs were women took up. In fact, the last station agent in Hopewell Junction was a woman, Elizabeth Cooper. And this was in 1968-69. Okay, back to the train ride. 1 or 2 over the trestle work. Here a number got off. Hopewell Junction and another brief halt, and then on to Millbrook. Here another stop. You want to pay attention. Millbrook is growing finely. Last July there was nothing in the way of a store or a dwelling visible about the depot. Now can be seen a 3-story brick hotel, a large store, a 2-story dwelling house, a large machine shop, a planing and sawmill, and 6 other houses. Also a brick tin shop. Here too was a fine brick building with a French roof, in which is located the main office of the Dutchess and Columbia Railroad Company. The telegraph operator, Miss Georgie Preston, another female, has an office in a really very pretty little passenger house. The station agent is A.T. Merritt. What's important about this paragraph, not only for you folks in Millbrook, but for any of us, including Hopewell Junction, the depot comes first. Nothing around it, probably in the woods. All of a sudden there'd be a clearing in the woods, the train would go through, then the tracks would disappear behind it in the woods. But once you have a railroad and a depot, you need people to maintain the railroad. And if you're having people to maintain the railroad, then you need, let's say, a rooming house for some of them. Many of these men were single. And on top of that, you might need a blacksmith shop for people to come to the depot. There was a rule of thumb, the 3-mile rule of thumb, and that is nobody would ride a horse or ride in a wagon more than about 3 miles to a railroad station. So, thus, one of the reasons why Hopewell, one of the last to be built on this here, because there was a station here in Brinkerhoff, and there's a station up here, and there was too long a ride, people wouldn't come. So people came to Millbrook on their horses, on their wagons. You needed a blacksmith, and after a while, people get hungry, come all the way into Millbrook to either pick up freight or pick up passengers. So you might as well have something to eat. So up pops a restaurant. etc. So this in 1870, this reporter is remarking how the town of Millbrook is growing. After a short delay, the train started again, passing Shunpike, Stissing, and Attleboro without stopping, reaching Pine Plains at 12:43 noon. As the excursion was a private one, there was no public reception. So that gives you an idea of what it was like. And you notice there was a freight car and there was a passenger car. And often these were combo kind of trains going up that particular way. So now we're talking about all these particular railroads, and by 1892, this is the heyday of railroad travel in Dutchess County. The delivery of coal was expanded to, as Paul will mention in a bit, to, let's say you had farmers who raised cattle, suddenly now they were becoming dairy farmers. And what happened there is they would put their fill their canisters with raw milk, put them on the depot walkway, or on the other hand, on decks that you find in your own backyards. And they would leave them on these wooden decks, and these trains would come by at a crawl, slowly, milk trains. And they would pick up the canisters, and in those days, bring them until 1901, brought them all the way down to Beacon, picked up the New York, and Hudson Valley went down to New York City for it to be pasteurized. And then Borden's Dairy establishes itself in 1901 in Hopewell Junction, right next to the depot. And so what happened there is that they could just bring these canisters all the way down to Hopewell, where they would be pasteurized and then sent down to Beacon and eventually down to New York City. So delivery of passengers to big cities such as Beacon, Poughkeepsie, and Danbury, or even the big town, if you wanted to expand your horizons but deflate your wallet, you could then go on to New York City. However, in the heyday of the railroad, 1892 to 1933, there was the beginning of not failure but weakness, let's call it, so that the Dutchess in Columbia became the Newburgh, Dutchess, and Connecticut Railway. Some of these other railways were around, but they were also weakening. And at the point of weakening, then the Central New England came in and began to consolidate all these railroads into one. It was also, too, you had different railroads, they were kind of like vying, you had to get equipment, you had to hire engineers, you had to hire firemen, conductors, you had to hire station agents, so there was a kind of consolidation going on. The third thing was, though, beginning in 1933 and ending in 1984, was the decline and almost extinction of internal railroads. In 1933, passenger service was stopped. Why? Well, two reasons. By the end of the Roaring '20s, most people had a Tin Lizzie of one sort or another. And they could use that car to go when they wanted to go, not when a train would come by and when they would be tied to a schedule. Second is the beginning of the Works Progress Administration under Roosevelt. Roads were being improved all over the country, including Little Dutchess County. And some were being paved, others were being certainly smoothed out if they were still dirt. So in 1933, passenger services stopped. For you folks here in Millbrook, these other lines may have kept up some passenger service, but the principal one here was gone. 1938, from Hopewell all the way up here, the tracks are pulled up. And the freight station at Hopewell was pulled down. And that's the end of those tracks. By the way, the metal was sold to Japan in 1938 and returned to the U.S. Certainly by December 7th. So, that happened at that particular point. In 1969, the Central New England was actually really an arm of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford. In 1969, the New York, New Haven, and Hartford failed. And at that particular point, it became Penn Central. Penn Central then became Conrail. no passenger service, essentially freight. We usually associate the name Conrail with freight. And then finally, Metro North. In 1974, Poughkeepsie Railroad, Highland Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge burns. Now you can't get from over here in Maybrook, you can't get over to Poughkeepsie. This railroad still exists, this one up to Hopewell still exists, and this one going over to Danbury still exists. But traffic starts to wane, 1974. For example, I interviewed a track worker who was working at the Hopewell Depot in 1974. He got a call from New York City that day, and it said, close up the depot by the end of the week, we're gone. So that was it. Then in 1982, the last scheduled train came out of Poughkeepsie, carrying freight and delivering it to various places along the way. That's 1982. 1984, these tracks are pulled up and it gets refurbished into the walkway, well, the walkway is that, but into the Dutchess County Rail Trail. So what's left here is out of Beacon, up to Fishkill, and then curving south. That's the only part that's left over. There was some freight, talking to an older station agent, that serviced Montford Brick and also serviced IBM a little bit. They had a siding. There was still some freight that would come up here even after this rail was pulled up. But beyond that, and there was a little bit that would go to Greenhaven Prison and stuff like that, but mostly it was gone after 1984. For a while it existed as an excursion train. You could park your car in Beacon, all the way up here, go all the way over to Danbury, or vice versa, and then the train would come back and bring you over here. So excursion, leaf peeping season, perhaps, or just a day out to go to Danbury. So that's a thumbnail sketch of the railroads in its history. It had a building phase when you had all this, let's say 1869 to 1892. It had a heyday from 1892 to 1933, and it had a general decline from 1933 to 1984, plus a few years, let's say the excursion trains being the last that came through. So at that particular point, that was the history of it. And a lot of these tracks had disappeared. Well, to stopping here just for a second, in 1995, a man named Richard Taylor wanted to get some welding done on his truck. And so I'm going to stop here, and then you're going to find out all these names of all these railroads. And before you leave, you have to take just a pop quiz. Everybody have pencil and paper?
I should mention before we leave that slide that there were 300 miles of track inside Dutchess County in the heyday when all of this railroads were being built. The interesting thing is only about 70 miles were the New York Central on the edges of the county. The rest of that track, 230 miles, was inside Dutchess County. And it's just hard to imagine that nowadays, because by the time most of us came along, the railroads were long gone. Also, at the very beginning, I mentioned that we have a little team of three here, John and Joe. Joe is going to speak in a minute, but I lied. We have one more person with us, and that is Bernie Rudberg. And some of you might remember, Bernie passed away about almost 2 years ago now, and he was the one that really was the mover and shaker behind our restoring the depot in Hopewell. Bernie's going to talk to you just a little bit about the many railroads in Dutchess County. I control that from here?
Just hope you can hear it. The best we've got is the PC speaker, so. I wonder if we can use that.
we changed the name to New York, Boston, and Montreal. So we go all the way to Montreal, Canada. Well, now that lasted less than a year. New York, Boston, and Montreal went bankrupt in the financial panic of 1873. So the line reverted back to being the Dutchess of Columbia again. In less than a year, in 1874, the Dutchess of Columbia declared bankruptcy and operated under the jurisdiction of the courts until it was reorganized in 1877. They became the Newburgh, Dutchess, and Connecticut. But one set of attraction had all these different names. The Newburgh, Dutchess, and Connecticut was a much more stable operation. George Burrow had learned his lesson by then, and he concentrated on the Dutchess County area. The ND&C Railroad had 58 miles of track entirely within Dutchess County. Well, that lasted 25 years. In 1904, it was bought out by the Central New England Railway, which was a branch of the New Haven Railroad system. There was New Haven Railroad money and New Haven Railroad people who ran it. And that lasted until 1927, when the CNE was absorbed formally into the New Haven Railroad. So as of 1927, the tracks and the depot became part of the New Haven Railroad. Now that lasted until 1968, when the New Haven Railroad failed. Well, at that time, the railroads of the northeastern part of the United States were in pretty bad shape. The Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central Railroad, and the New Haven Railroad were all bound together into one humongous railroad called the Penn Central. Well, that didn't last very long. The Penn Central lasted about 2 years, and when the railroads in the Northeast were about ready to collapse, the federal government stepped in and created Conrail. So during the last few years of operation here, the station was operated by Conrail. And the big bridge in Poughkeepsie burned in May of 1974. Traffic from the west stopped. There were a few customers along the line between Poughkeepsie and Hopewell, but not enough to keep the line. So in 1984, the tracks were torn out, and Dutchess County bought the line, turned it into a utility corridor, and later into a rail trail. And meanwhile, the Housatonic Railroad had purchased a part of the tracks that remained in Hopewell Junction. They in turn sold the tracks to NTA Metro North, which is now the current owner. So as you can see, from all these various names, over the years, the tracks through Hopewell Junction had 13 different corporate names.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Bernie made about a dozen of those videos, and we have them on a laptop, actually 2 laptops. People can watch them when they visit the depot. Speaking of the depot, this is your depot here in Millbrook, and they were almost carbon copies of each other, except that the depot here in Millbrook had another addition on the side of a freight room. Was probably about 10 or 20, not the size maybe of a garage, 10 or 20 foot square on the north end of the, but the rest of the building were almost identical. The roof lines were just about the same, and the amount of elbow room inside the station itself were just about the same. Okay, just a little summary. How did the railroads change life in rural areas like this? Well, they altered agriculture because Gail Borden decided that he could take the railroads and make them work if we had enough dairy farms. And if you could put the milk out twice a day in those lovely little cans we now use for mailboxes, and have them picked up He could bring the milk into a pasteurizing station or a creamery. There was a large one in Hopewell, but there were also several others in Dutchess County. Borden himself was from Warwick. He made a lot of money in the Civil War through his invention of condensed milk and selling it to the Union so that soldiers could reconstitute the milk, and they were a little better nourished maybe than the Confederate soldiers. And then he took that money. He also had to reconstitute the product itself, because after the war he had to keep it going, so he got a bunch of doctors together, and they put together a series of combinations or formulas, and it became the basis for baby formula in the late 19th century until the early 20th century, when Carnation came in with evaporated milk, and that became the basis for baby formula in the early 20th century. At any rate, dairy farming isn't easier. No farming is that easy, but it was more predictable. And Dutchess County, on a large scale, went over to dairy farming. From what we understand in the records of the Borden's establishment in Hopewell, they sent 6,000 gallons of milk to New York City every day from 1901 to 1950. Wow. And that's just one creamery. Industry. It changed the nature of life here in Dutchess County. Cities were already near the railroads. So that in Poughkeepsie, and what later became Beacon, you had hat factories, you had the Nabisco printing plants. In Poughkeepsie, you had De Laval separator, you had Sedgwick elevator works, you had Western printing. All of them used the railroads both to get their supplies in and to send out their finished products. But it happened also in the rural areas too. In Fishkill Plains, you had Van Wyck and Stringham. From Fishkill Plains, they shipped flapjack flour out to the rest of the country. And this played itself out in almost every community that was touched by the railroads. And by the way, the map we had up before, those 300 miles of track touched every single town in Dutchess County. Sometimes they just nicked it, sometimes they went right through the middle of it, but that meant that life was altered by the presence of the railroads. Communication, of course, telegraph lines were established along with the railroads, but they also carried the telephone line. So the first telephone in Hopewell Junction was in that building, right? And the first payphone was in that building. So, and people went down to the station because the telegraph and the telephones were bringing in the news of the world, and they hung around the stations. It became a community center, and they learned what was going on, and they had conversation, and then they went and voted, we hope. Education changed. Most of the schools in the area went up to maybe 8th grade, and that was it, because these were farming communities. They taught you to read and write, and that was when they said goodbye. By the 1920s, though, if you wanted a high school education, they put on the rails special trains that would take you from areas like Pleasant Valley and Beacon, and Hopewell, and they would take you down to Beacon or into Poughkeepsie. We have some pictures in the depot of these trains. They were actually gas-driven. Front end usually was a Mack truck, and they had railroad wheels, and they ran on the tracks, and they scooted in between the regular trains, all onto sidings, and they got the kids down to school, and then they brought them back home again. On the back was welded what looks like a New York City trolley, and they took these vehicles to school, and they got their secondary education. All right, as long as they got home in time to milk the cows, they're still okay. It changed tourism. Moore's Mills had a large resort-type hotel. People were coming up from the city, and they would come to rural areas, Billings, Poquay, Whaley Lake, and they would spend their vacations around here, and they came up by way of the railroads. Okay? And lastly, of course, it connected us with the outside world. These were east-west connections. These railroads not so much for the traveler, but for the freight. They were bringing stuff in from the west into not just New York, but into southern Connecticut and Rhode Island, southern Massachusetts. This was the main way to go east and west. So those are all the enormous changes that the railroads brought and changed the nature of life here in Dutchess County. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Joe, and you can talk a little bit about Hopewell Depot. This is the commercial side.
Yeah, okay. We can use these 4 pictures. As I mentioned before, one thing I wanted to mention, Paul had said, how do you go over by Whaley Lake and up the mountain? One of the reasons Hopewell is called a junction is because of 3 railroads, but the other, we had a railroad yard, and it had a repair shop and several sidings. On some of those sidings sat pusher engines, which would be steam engines, a lot larger than a typical steam engine, much slower than a steam engine, but what it would do is the train was, let's say, pulling out of Hopewell Junction, this larger steam engine would couple to the caboose and basically shoulder it up and over the mountain. Once it was going down the other side, see ya, and it was back all the way back down to Hopewell Junction. The same was happening in Danbury, where they would get a pusher engine and push it up over the hill, and then 1947, it was the advent of the diesel engine. But diesel engines were rather weak, maybe weaker than some steam engines. So they also used pusher engines too, to get them up over a high hill or mountains away. Right? So I just wanted to add that thing. That's one of the reasons why Hopewell Junction is a large area. If you come to the depot sometime, you'll see a magnificent, it's a work of art by one of the volunteers. And it's a beautiful bird's eye view to scale of Hopewell Junction circa 1923. And it's a wonderful thing. It's sort of our masterpiece sitting in the middle of the railway station. Richard Taylor comes over here to a welding shop to get something repaired on his truck. He sees this building over here. He asks somebody at the station, at the welding shop, what is that? The guy said, I don't know, it's an old railroad building. All around it is junk. Well, that day, the first of the 2 principal people involved in the restoration of the depot was motivated. Rich Taylor began taking pictures. He got Bernie Rudberg involved. Rich is a wonderful carpenter and an inspired volunteer. And he got together other inspired volunteers, and basically what happened is this became that by 2011. And this was the old signal station, 196. 195 was in Poughkeepsie. It was torn down in 1938. No reason to have it anymore. And here's the volunteers, and they put that back up in 16, a replica of it. At that point, and this is it. That's it. You want to go on? I think that's part of it, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have that. So from our perspective, and I think from the community's perspective, the depot and Depot Park is really a gift from the community to the community. As we've said here tonight, this is all volunteer. We've got no professional activity here, no government activity. Everything that we've got has been done by volunteers for preservation of the history of railroads in Dutchess County and the teaching of it. So we treat it as a symbol for the area. We're looking at it as an area where people can congregate, kind of a part of the community. We've helped with the regeneration of the whole activity in the area. We've gone through some pretty good cycles in the Hopewell area with the buildup of IBM and then the drop of IBM, and it's been an interesting area, but we see a resurgence in there now. So one of the key parts of our task, as we've missioned ourselves, is the preservation and the teaching and bringing the history of railroads in Dutchess County to the community. So outreach is one of the key activities we do. And this year we've done about 5 presentations like this one, or we'll be doing about 5. We've had 4 or 5 tours of the depot. We had a display at a local library. We've had a presentation at the depot from 3 retired folks that used to work on the railroad. It was a very interesting afternoon. And we've had students in. We're open for field trips. We're working with schools in the area to try to bring more field trips in to help teach young people what the history of the railroads were, how they, just as you've heard tonight, how the railroads developed the Industrial Revolution or worked with the Industrial Revolution in our area. The children today have no idea what went on back then. So one of our real missions is to try to preserve and teach that. Go ahead. So when we first started to try to, and this is just a little bit of history and information, to make sure that we did things right, we got a grant from Dyson Corporation to work with a consultant, brought us in, helped us develop our bylaws, our rules and regulation, all the attributes we needed to be a good, solid, nonprofit organization. We finished the yard diorama, the one that John just talked about. It's a large diorama that you can look down at, a model of what the area looked like in 1923. It's great for explaining things to people. Built a replica of the signal tower, and that was opened in 2013, 14. And then we're in the process now of just finishing a 20-foot by 40-foot open pavilion for people on the rail trail, people that use the depot. So we're trying to develop that as a park, as a local depot park, we call it. A couple weeks ago, we presented to the East Fishkill Planning Board to make sure that we're in sync with what they're doing, give us their ideas and how we can continue to develop this area. So now comes the commercial. We saved the commercial for the end. And by the way, the last bullet on there, we have received our provisional charter as an official New York State museum under the New York State Regents. So, and it's interesting, in New York State, until you're chartered under the Regents, you can't legally call yourself a museum. So we had to do that to get chartered so we can call ourselves a museum. And John now is also in the process of submitting an application to get us on the National Historic Registry. So we're just trying to keep things going, keep the area developed, and work with the town. So to do this costs money. And again, it's all through contributions and volunteers. Just some examples. Our telephone bill is about $360 a year, probably not much different from what most people's. $250 a month for insurance, $320 a year for security. We have to have security there. We have a set of cameras, and we're tied in. $100 a month for our electric bill, and about $35 a month for postage and mailing. There's always, and if you're a member of the Historical Society, I'm sure you have a lot of budget activities too. The only point that we're putting this up is if you're interested in supporting us, this is the commercial part. We're always looking for donations. We're looking for members. And not only do we need money, but probably more importantly, we need volunteers. So if any of you live down south or would like to come down and volunteer as a docent, as a tour host, or for many other activities we have, whether it's event planning or board membership, there's always a lot of things to be done, and we need volunteers. That's really how you can help. And if you want to give us some donations, here's where you can do it. And when you come down, I think, Paul, you mentioned, we have a couple of large tablets that have 12 or 13 short presentations done by Bernie, that we managed to preserve some of that knowledge in his head before we lost him, and they're available for you to view when you come down to the depot. So that's our presentation. Questions? Comments? We'll start way in the end.
Okay, way back when that fire happened on the railroad bridge over the Hudson, there were a lot of very strong rumors about arson. Did you ever hear anything about that?
From what I know, I'm not highly voiced in that or viewed in that, but from what I know, the railroad really didn't want to maintain that bridge. So they didn't provide, I believe, the folks on the bridge that would be watching for sparks and fires that might have started. So by the time they found out about the fire, it was going pretty good. But I think, I don't think it was arson, I hadn't heard that. But I had heard that the railroad wasn't that interested in keeping and maintaining the cost of the bridge, so they weren't too worried about it.
That was the Penn Central era, which lasted 10 years, and it was a big fiasco. That was a combination of the New Haven, Pennsylvania, and the New York Central, all of whom needed help, and they combined to try to salvage what they could. But this line had become rather unpopular with management. They weren't making much profit from it. Maintaining the bridge was difficult. However, maintaining the equipment was important, and that goes all the way back to throughout the history of railroads. You always see engineers and firemen and the other trainmen carrying an oil can. The oil can was to oil the trucks that were under every railroad train. The 2 trucks, you know, remember your Lionel sets, they had to be oiled. Otherwise, they locked up. Now you have steel dragging on steel. They were always putting out fires on either side of the railroad. And they had 4 different extinguisher boxes on that bridge, and none of them were being maintained. In fact, the guy who was supposed to call in if there was a fire was still at home in Highland. He hadn't gone on duty yet. They didn't have somebody 24/7. All right? So it was neglect. And I don't think it was any kind of arson or anything like that.
Arson, the word arson had been kicked
Yeah.
around.
You know, it's not,
But there was, I also heard there was between New York Central and whatever that train line used the bridge, DNA.
yeah.
There was some competition there for business, to get business.
Right.
I don't
They really
know.
didn't cooperate with each other very
Yeah, I
much.
didn't get involved that much.
Okay, there was,
But I remember, the railroad bridge there. One time we were in Poughkeepsie, and there was during World War II, there was a freight train that came over from the Highland side, and we watched the whole train. And when the engines got to the point where they got out of sight behind trees in Poughkeepsie, that's when the caboose finally came out of the Highland trees. The whole train was flat cars with tanks, army tanks.
that was probably pretty heavy too.
Yeah. I was
Okay, there was another question in the middle about there?
It was answered.
Okay, and one here?
Yeah, there's a really good-looking display of a railroad station at the Dutchess County Fair. I
Yes,
think it came from Pleasant Valley.
yes.
We work with them, we
It
help
was
support
the
them.
B&E station, the original
Now,
one,
The-
behind
that-
Pleasant Valley Ford.
Right,
And they brought it up to West Road School.
yeah,
It was on the grounds of West Road School for a long time. Dutchess County Agricultural Society arranged for it to be dismantled and professionally brought up to that little village that they're trying to create up by the racetrack inside the
all right, well, my question is,
fairgrounds.
that railroad station, when it was operating, where did the railroad that went through it, where did it come from, and where did it go to?
Pretty much followed Route 44, and then up into Salt Point Turnpike. And then it came out to this line, the line that came through Millbrook, and joined up around Stissing Junction, which is probably about 8 or 10 miles north of here. That was the Poughkeepsie and Easter. They actually had the idea that they would be able to attract some coal into Poughkeepsie, and they would be able to ship the coal on that railroad. That never worked out. That railroad lasted about 25 years, but it went under about 4 times and came back under different names and everything else. But it never really achieved its potential as a railroad.
When, I can answer a little bit of that. The rail line that came into Pleasant Valley, paralleled one of the western off streets from Route 44, and then curved to the north and came down a rather steep hill between the power station and Route 45. Route 44, where it goes through that rock cut, was, the rail line was between there and that power station, and it came down. I remember seeing trains come down there and stopped at that, the first stop in Pleasant Valley was like a farm supply place, chicken feed, that's where we got chicken feed.
Okay. There was another question, ma'am?
You mentioned about the Borden being in down south here.
Was right next to the depot.
Yes, well, didn't Borden also form headquarters in Passaic and Route 22 in the Holland Valley, which kept that trade very much on focus?
I know there were a number of Borden plants around. I don't know the
Yes.
history of them, where they all were.
Passaic, one in Dutchess.
Passaic was
It's
one
the
of the first.
original Borden.
Okay,
Yes,
The original Borden one
Still
was in
there.
Wassaic,
yes.
Yeah.
okay.
and
And there was a question in the back?
So the original rail line that came through Millbrook is the Dutchess and Columbia, but it never seemed to make it to Columbia, right? It makes it to Pine Plains and then turns east, so
Yeah.
why is it called Dutchess and Columbia?
When they originally built the railroads to take the coal over, that was the only way they could get through the mountains without going over big hills. And it wasn't until they had the engines powerful enough that they could go over Stoneville Mountain. But I don't know about, it just touched Columbia County, I guess, didn't it? The railroad just touched Columbia
A
County.
little bit.
Yes, the DNC, the Dutchess and Columbia, the original line through here, just to give you an idea, that at Beacon, you're almost, well, Beacon wasn't there, Dutchess Junction, you're not very, maybe 100 feet above sea level at that point. And as you come up that line, through the whole of Dutchess County, 57 miles to Pine Plains, you're going up to about 200 feet. And then when you took a left and went over toward Millerton, through a rock cut at Winchell's Mountain. And that was how they got those little trains up the elevation instead of trying to go over the mountains. And there was one other, you asked another.
Why is it called Columbia if it doesn't make it to Columbia?
Oh, it didn't make it into Columbia. They cut over and they ran along what is now 199, over to Millerton, and then State Line, and then Canaan, Connecticut. But the Rhinebeck and Connecticut actually ran along the Dutchess-Columbia line. It went in and out. Silvernails, Ankrum, went all the way up to Copiague, then turned and came back and went over to Connecticut on the same line as the DNC. But again, sometimes they name these railroads, like the Boston, Montreal, and New York Railroad. They had wonderful delusions of grandeur as to what these things were going to be. And of course, that was also a little bit of a gimmick to get people interested in investing. But they never reached that potential. Most of these railroads never went out of Dutchess County, with the exception of the Rhinebeck in Connecticut.
Okay, over here, yes ma'am?
Oh, you have to stress the fact that every post office started by the railroad in Dutchess County. If you look at where the old post offices were, they were always by the railroad.
And the post office in Hopewell Junction is right across the street from the depot, the original one.
Hopewell's interesting from the point of view that that building was the first actual commercial building in what later became Hopewell Junction. It was just plain Hopewell. There was a little hamlet about a mile north of where the station is, up on Beekman Road. Most of the stations were placed in towns that were already there from the colonial period on. But not Hopewell Junction. It's more like what you have out west, where the railroad comes through and creates a town. So when you come down to see us, we'll show you some of the buildings, and most of those buildings, believe it or not, came in the railroad in kits from Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck, because they are all very, very identical buildings. When you go through Hopewell, you'll go, you know, this is old, they should tear these, my wife says they should tear these buildings down, and I'm going, oh, no, this is history here. But, so, anyway, you'll see that. But Hopewell is a town that was created by the railroad. And it wasn't Hopewell Junction for maybe another 10 years when actually two railroads met. And that didn't take place until the 1880s. So 1873, when they said we weren't getting enough business between Brinkerhoff and LaGrange, it's a 10-mile run, they decided to plop that station in the middle of a field, and the town grew up around it. When you make that terrible turn on Route 376 by the Hopewell Inn, it goes like this, all right? You're turning off a side street in those days onto the main drag. That was Railroad Avenue, and that was the town, okay? What's up on Route 82 now, that came much later. That came more in the 1950s. So come down and see us. And if you need this information, I've got it up here.
John?
How,
I'm sorry.
tell us some comments about, how did they actually get the land? Was it by eminent domain, or did they buy it out? And what happened to the land after the railroad went through?
In the 1940s, New York, New Haven, and Hartford offered, in several letters of which we've seen, to basically offer back the land that they had taken before. The letters don't indicate whether it was eminent domain or somebody sold it to them. The one letter they don't have, and this is part of an archive of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford at the University of Connecticut in stores. The one letter they don't have is the Hopewell Junction letter. Doesn't, so whether they ever offered someone, whether it was just in the woods, maybe the Dutchess in Columbia bought the woods, who owned it, who knows. Another thing about many of these railroads is a lot of times what they did is they didn't have a community such as Hopewell. And so there was no one to register that this land was taken by the railroad and a depot was put up. It just happened. That happened more in the Midwest and the Far West. But even in Dutchess County, in our backyard, that did happen. So maybe there was no letter to be offered to anybody, and didn't know who to send it to, so they just kept it. That was the end of the line.
In the back.
You mentioned a book title that I can't remember, by McDermott.
Yeah, it was, boy, I've just lost it too. It's William McDermott. It's the history of Dutchess County railroads. I think that might be. If you type in William McDermott, I've written him a letter. He's still alive in Connecticut. I've written him a letter, but he never responded back to me. I wanted to have a long conversation with him about where he got some of the information. He got a lot of that information, including that quote from George Brown that I read. He got that from the Fishkill Standard and the reporting of that in 1867. So I think that was one of his big sources. Fishkill Standard you can read if you have any desire to. If you go down to the Beacon Public Library, they have it on microfiche. So, but nonetheless, it's there, and if you want to spend some time, you can read through it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for having us. Remember, if you want to sign up to visit on Saturday, come see me and I'll write your name down.